They said no man alive could last on Thunder, the black stallion that turned cowboys into fools and made prideful men kiss the dirt. But on one scorching Texas afternoon, as the crowd roared for blood, a forgotten old horseman stepped forward. No rope, no whip, just patience. What happened inside that corral would silence the town, crush a tyrant's pride, and leave behind a lesson no one would ever forget. The summer sun hung heavy over the small Texas town, beating down on the dusty fairgrounds where the annual rodeo was about to begin. The smell of grilled brisket and sweet corn floated in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of horse sweat and leather. Families walked shoulder to shoulder between stalls of cowboy hats and shiny boots, their laughter mixing with the faint strains of a fiddle drifting from a nearby stage. It was the one weekend of the year when everyone gathered, not just for food and music, but for spectacle. At the center of the arena, beneath a banner that read Dalton Ranch Rodeo Show, stood Frank Dalton. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a spotless white Stetson, Frank had the kind of presence that filled a space before he even spoke. His family's ranch stretched across thousands of acres, his cattle numbered in the hundreds, and his wealth was obvious in the silver buckle that gleamed under the Texas Sunday. But what he valued most wasn't the land or the cattle. It was the pride of owning the wildest, most feared horse anyone in the county had ever seen. Frank raised his hand, and the chatter of the crowd fell into a tense silence. A gate clanged open, and a stallion burst into view. The horse was massive, black as midnight, his mane flying like a storm cloud and his eyes burning with a feral fire. The announcer's voice rang over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Thunder, the untamable king of Dalton Ranch." Thunder slammed his hooves against the dirt, sending a spray of dust into the stands. He reared high, nostrils flaring, letting out a scream that cut through the summer air. Children clutched their parents' arms, and even seasoned cowboys shifted uneasily at the sight. This wasn't just any rodeo horse. Thunder was legend, a creature of raw fury, one that no rider had ever managed to stay atop for more than a few seconds. Frank paced in front of the crowd, his voice loud and proud. "You've all heard the stories. No man has lasted more than 30 seconds on Thunder's back. Not my ranch hands, not traveling riders, not even the best from Fort Worth. Today, I'm giving this town a chance. $5,000 to anyone who can ride him for a single minute." The crowd erupted in a mix of gasps and cheers. $5,000 was a fortune in a town where most folks scraped by raising cattle or fixing fences. But the laughter that followed told another truth. Everyone knew what usually happened when someone dared to try. A group of young men stood by the rails, nudging each other with bravado. One of them, tall and wiry, pulled his hat low and swung his leg over the rail. The crowd hollered encouragement, eager for the show. He lasted all of 8 seconds before Thunder whipped sideways, sending him flying into the dust. Another followed, and another. Each one hit the ground harder than the last, limping away as the audience roared with a mix of laughter and pity. 8 seconds, 10 seconds, that's the best y'all can do? Frank boomed, grinning as though each failure was a victory for him. He thrived on it, the spectacle of young men humbled, the reminder that his horse was a beast no one could conquer. At the far end of the bleachers, a boy named Eli clung to the railing, his eyes wide. Barely 14, with dusty boots too big for him and a straw hat that sagged on his head, Eli had grown up hearing tales of cowboys who could tame anything on 4 legs. But Thunder was different. The stallion seemed less like an animal and more like a storm, given flesh. The boy's heart hammered with a strange mix of terror and awe. Beside him, his mother tightened her grip on his shoulder. "Don't even think about it, Eli. That horse'll kill a man twice your size." Eli said nothing, but he couldn't look away. In that horse's fury, he saw something no one else did: loneliness, wild and unyielding, like it was carrying a wound no one had tried to heal. Frank tipped his hat to the crowd, feeding on their attention. "Anyone else? Or is this town as spineless as the riders I've seen today?" His challenge stung. Laughter rippled through the stands, some jeering at the riders who had already failed, others egging on anyone foolish enough to try next. Thunder stomped the ground, dust rising in choking clouds. The sun burned hotter, sweat rolling down faces in the crowd, but no one left their seat. They wanted more. They wanted blood, spectacle, or perhaps a miracle. Frank lifted his hand again, letting the moment stretch. "1 minute," he said, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "1 minute for $5,000. Who's man enough?" The arena fell silent. The only sound was Thunder's furious snort, his body coiled like a spring ready to explode. The air seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere deep in the crowd, a shadow stirred, an old man no one had noticed before, his hat pulled low, his steps slow and deliberate. But for now, the crowd's eyes stayed locked on the storm raging inside the pen, and the legend of Thunder grew darker with every breath he took. The dust had barely settled from the last failed attempt when the crowd's laughter swelled again, echoing around the rodeo grounds like a cruel song. Riders brushed themselves off, limping away from the pen with their pride bruised far worse than their bones. Thunder stood in the center of the corral, black coat glistening with sweat, sides heaving, but his eyes burned as fiercely as ever. Each defeat only seemed to fuel his rage, as if he thrived on throwing men to the dirt. Frank Dalton leaned against the rail, his smile broad, his voice booming across the stands. That's what happens when a boy thinks he can face a storm. Who else wants to try? $5,000 for a single minute, folks. Just one. He waved his hand as if daring anyone to take the challenge. A tall cowboy with a sun-scorched face stepped forward, the kind of man who'd spent a lifetime breaking broncs. The crowd cheered as he climbed the fence, swinging into the pen with the swagger of experience. He tugged at his gloves, spat into the dirt, and nodded at the gatekeeper. For a moment, anticipation rippled through the air. Maybe this one had a chance. The rider swung into the saddle, gripping tight. Thunder exploded beneath him. The stallion launched upward, twisting in the air, his body contorting with violent precision. Dust erupted in clouds as hooves struck earth. The man held on for 12 seconds before Thunder threw a sidekick so vicious it sent the rider flying sideways, crashing into the rails. The crowd gasped, then erupted in a roar. "Not even close," Frank shouted, raising his arms to feed the frenzy. A second rider, younger but cocky, pushed past his friends. His boots pounded against the dirt as he climbed onto Thunder's back, teeth clenched in determination. For a few breathless seconds, he rode the storm, the crowd counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, until Thunder reared so high the boy slid back, lost his grip, and hit the ground hard. The countdown dissolved into laughter and jeers. The announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. "That makes 6 riders today, none lasting past 15 seconds. Folks, you're looking at a creature that doesn't know the word surrender." Thunder pawed at the dirt, snorting, his breath steaming in the hot air. He threw his head, mane flying like a dark banner, his hooves drumming a warning into the ground. The stallion was no longer just an animal to the crowd, he was a force of nature, a storm given muscle and bone. A few men muttered from the bleachers, shaking their heads. "That horse ain't right. He's got the devil in him." Another spat tobacco juice and said, "Or maybe he just hates the fools who think they can own him." The crowd's excitement thickened into something sharper, fear mixed with awe. No one wanted to climb into that pen anymore, yet no one could look away. Every failed attempt, every broken pride, only deepened Thunder's legend. Eli's heart pounded as he clung to the rail. He'd never seen such power up close. The way Thunder's muscles rippled under his black coat, the way his eyes flared like sparks. It terrified him and yet pulled him closer, like fire to a moth. He whispered to himself, though his mother couldn't hear. He's not just angry, he's daring them. Another rider, emboldened by the taunts, climbed the fence. He barely made it onto Thunder's back before being slammed into the dirt with bone-rattling force. The crowd roared with savage delight, the air vibrating with their shouts. Frank tipped his hat again, strutting like a showman. "See there, you can't tame Thunder. You can't even last a breath. That horse belongs to me, and he bows to no man." The horse screamed, a shrill sound that cut through every cheer and laugh. For a heartbeat, the crowd fell silent, spines stiffening as if they'd all felt the warning in that cry. Dust swirled in the heat, and the arena seemed to hold its breath. Thunder struck the ground with such force that the boards of the corral rattled. A woman clutched her child closer, whispering a prayer. Men who moments before had laughed now pressed their lips tight, their eyes uneasy. For the first time, the spectacle felt dangerous, as though the stallion's fury could tear straight through the rails. The announcer tried to regain control of the mood, forcing cheer into his voice. "Any more takers?" 5,000 still waiting. But no one moved. Riders who had bragged an hour ago now stared at the ground, unwilling to meet Frank's eyes. Frank's smile faltered, his pride stung by the crowd's hesitation. "Come on, folks, don't tell me this whole town is nothing but cowards." His words sparked murmurs, but no one rose. Eli watched, silent and wide-eyed, gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles whitened. Somewhere deep inside, he wasn't thinking about money or pride. He was thinking about the horse itself, how every snort, every defiant kick seemed less like madness and more like a desperate cry. Thunder stood tall in the center of the corral, black coat gleaming in the sun, a living storm that no man could ride. The crowd had come for a show of strength, and they had witnessed it not in the riders who failed, but in the horse that refused to bow. The legend of Thunder had grown, and the day was far from over. The roar of the crowd began to fade into a restless murmur. Dust still hung in the air, shimmering in the heat, carrying the scent of sweat and leather. Thunder circled the corral, snorting, stomping, his muscles trembling with unspent fury. But no one dared step forward anymore. For the first time that day, the space around the pen felt heavy with unease. Frank Dalton paced along the fence, his jaw tight, his pride pricked by the silence. He had expected endless challenges, men too stubborn to back down, too desperate for money to think twice. Instead, the bravado had vanished. Hats were pulled low, boots shuffled in the dirt, and not a single rider looked his way. "Is this it?" Frank bellowed, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "This is the proudest town in Texas, and you let a horse shame you into silence?" He gestured toward Thunder, who threw his head back with a wild scream, as though mocking them all. Somewhere in the back of the bleachers, a child began to cry. A woman whispered prayers under her breath. Men folded their arms, scowling at the ground, unwilling to admit their fear. The rodeo, which had begun with laughter and excitement, was shifting into something darker, a contest no longer just between man and beast, but between courage and humiliation. It was then that movement stirred at the far edge of the stands. An old man pushed himself slowly to his feet. His hat was battered and sweat-stained, his denim shirt worn thin at the elbows, and his boots carried the dust of decades. He leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane as he began the long walk toward the arena. The crowd noticed him almost at once. Whispers spread like ripples across water. "Who's that? Is he drunk? No, that's Henry Walker, ain't it? Henry Walker." The name carried with it a story half forgotten. Years ago, he had been known across counties as a horseman, someone who could gentle a Mustang without breaking its spirit, who taught ranchers patience in a world that prized force. But time had passed. His back had bent, his knees had stiffened, and his name had been buried under the dust of younger, louder men. Frank saw him approach and laughed, throwing his head back. "Well, I'll be the ghost of Walker Ranch himself. You here to try your luck, old man? Careful, you'll break before you hit the ground." The laughter of Frank's ranch hands followed, sharp and cutting. Henry didn't answer. He paused at the edge of the arena, resting both hands on his cane. His eyes pale, weathered, steady were fixed not on Frank but on Thunder. The stallion, restless and furious moments before, stopped circling and froze. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as if he smelled something familiar, something that pulled at a memory buried deep within his wildness. The crowd grew quieter. Even the children stopped fidgeting. It was as though an invisible line had been drawn, not between Frank and Henry, nor between Henry and the crowd, but between Henry and the horse. "I'm not here for your money," Henry said at last. His voice was low, roughened by age, but carried clear through the hush. "I don't need $5,000, and I've no pride left to win back. I only came to show this town one thing. A horse doesn't bow to a whip. He bows to respect." The words lingered in the heat. Some people scoffed, shaking their heads. Others frowned, uncertain, and a few, just a few, leaned forward, their eyes caught by the calm in the old man's tone. Frank sneered. "Respect? That horse is a demon. He's chewed up better men than you. If you step into that pen, he'll crush you flat." He gestured to the broken riders, still nursing their bruises on the sidelines. "Ask them if respect matters when you're lying in the dirt with your ribs cracked." Henry finally lifted his gaze from Thunder and looked at Frank. His expression was neither angry nor afraid, only steady. "Maybe so, but I didn't come here to fight him. I came to listen." The silence that followed was unlike any before. No jeers, no cheers, only the slow creak of the wooden bleachers as people shifted uneasily. Eli leaned so far over the rail his mother grabbed his shirt to pull him back. His heart hammered in his chest. To him, the old man didn't look weak at all. He looked like someone who belonged here, like someone who had been waiting for this moment all along. Thunder stamped the ground, but not as violently as before. His breath came hard, his sides heaving, but his eyes never left Henry. It was as though, for the first time, the stallion had met someone who didn't look at him as an enemy or a prize. Frank spat into the dirt, furious at losing the crowd's attention. "Fine," he growled. "Step in, make a fool of yourself. But when that horse tears you apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Henry shifted his weight, lifted his cane, and set it against the rail. Without it, he stood straighter than anyone expected. His shoulders squared, his boots planted firm in the dust. For a moment, under the pitiless Texas sun, he looked less like an old man and more like the rider he had once been. The crowd held its breath as he reached for the latch of the gate, and thunder waited. The latch of the corral groaned as Henry's hand hovered over it, his weathered fingers brushing the hot metal. The crowd leaned forward, a ripple of anticipation running through the stands. No one quite believed what they were seeing, an old man, gray-haired and stooped by years, preparing to step into a ring where seasoned riders had just been broken and humiliated. Frank Dalton seized the moment, climbing the rail to make himself taller, his voice dripping with mockery. "So this is what it's come to? A washed-up has been trying to prove he's still got teeth? You want to give these folks a memory, Walker? They'll remember the day you crawled out on a stretcher." Laughter scattered across the bleachers, but it lacked the bite it had earlier. Many had seen the way thunder had gone still when Henry appeared, the way the stallion's ears had pricked and his gaze locked onto the old man. There was something different in the air, something heavier than ridicule. Henry set his cane aside, his back straightening a fraction more, his chest rising with a long breath. His voice cut through the noise, calm but unshakable. "I told you, Frank, I didn't come for your money. I came to show that respect weighs more than any whip." He rested his hand on the gate, eyes never leaving thunder. "Open it." Gasps broke out. Someone muttered, "He's crazy," another whispered, "or he knows something we don't." The announcer, nervous now, hesitated. He glanced at Frank, who waved him on with a sneer. Let him hang himself. With a squeal of hinges, the gate swung wide. Heat rushed in from the arena, thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Thunder poured the ground, snorting, clouds into the air, his body tense as a bowstring. He swung his massive head toward Henry, eyes glinting like molten amber. Henry stepped inside. The dirt crunched beneath his boots, every step deliberate, steady, as though he was walking into a church instead of a battlefield. Behind him, the gate clanged shut. The sound reverberated through the stands like a drum beat. There was no turning back. Frank cupped his hands around his mouth and jeered. "Careful, Walker. One step too close, and they'll be dragging what's left of you out of there." His words clawed at the air, but the crowd wasn't laughing this time. They were too busy watching the two figures in the pen, one frail and weathered, the other fierce and untamed, drawn into a silent standoff. Thunder's hooves hammered against the earth, sending tremors through the boards. His mane whipped as he circled, throwing dust in every direction. Each time he wheeled around, his massive frame cut closer to Henry, daring him to flinch. But Henry didn't move. He planted himself in the middle of the corral, boots sunk into the dirt, hands at his sides, palms open. His eyes followed Thunder's every turn, not in fear but in focus, as though he was listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. The crowd murmured nervously. "Why isn't he moving?" a boy whispered. His father hushed him, unable to explain. Thunder lunged suddenly, charging forward with a scream that rattled the rafters. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Eli's breath caught in his throat, his fingers gripping the rail until they burned. But at the last possible moment, Thunder veered off, dirt flying as his hooves dug furrows into the ground. He thundered past Henry, missing him by mere inches. Henry didn't flinch. He raised one hand, slowly, palm open toward the horse, as if offering not challenge but peace. The crowd's gasp rolled like thunder itself. Frank barked a laugh, desperate to keep control. "That, don't prove a thing. He's just playing with you, old man." Henry ignored him. His hand hovered in the air, not demanding, not pleading, only waiting. Thunder tossed his head, circling tighter now, his breath harsh and loud, his muscles bunched with every movement, but his eyes flickered back to the open palm. Uncertain, the tension in the air was unbearable. Dust stuck to the sweat on brows, hats fanned faces that had gone pale, but no one looked away. Even the announcer's microphone hissed, silent, forgotten. At last, Henry spoke, so softly the first rows barely heard. "I don't want to break you, boy. I want to understand you." A ripple moved through the crowd. The words struck something deeper than bravado or pride. They rang with a truth long forgotten in a place where power was measured by domination. Thunder halted, one hoof pawing the dirt. His chest heaved, his nostrils flaring. For the first time that day, he didn't charge, didn't kick. He simply stood, watching Henry with wary eyes. The silence was so heavy it felt alive. Even Frank, for all his bluster, felt it pressing against his chest. He spat into the dust, his grin faltering. Henry lowered his hand, his body still as stone. "This isn't about strength," he said, his voice carrying. "It's about patience." The crowd stirred, confused, moved, unsettled. Eli's eyes burned with something he couldn't name: hope, fear, awe, all tangled together. And Thunder, the beast that had humiliated everyone before, didn't move, not forward, not away. He simply waited, caught in a fragile, invisible thread stretched between him and the old man. The challenge had begun, but it was nothing like the town had expected. The gate shut behind Henry with a final metallic clang, and the sound seemed to echo through every chest in the arena. The old man no longer had the cane to steady himself. It leaned against the fence like a forgotten relic. He stood alone now in the wide circle of dirt, facing the restless storm of muscle and fury that was Thunder. The stallion pawed the ground, sending up bursts of dust that shimmered in the Texas Sunday. Each breath came in a hot snort, flaring nostrils, steam rolling from his body as if he carried fire inside. He circled slowly, a predator gauging its prey. The crowd held its breath, every eye riveted to the space between the horse and the man. Henry took his first step into the center. His boots sank into the soft dirt, his shadow stretching long across the ground. He did not hurry, did not shift nervously the way the younger riders had. He walked with the patience of someone who had walked into danger many times before and knew that fear only fed the beast. Thunder wheeled suddenly, hooves hammering against the boards, sending vibrations through the rails. Mothers clutched their children tighter, while the men muttered curses under their breath. The horse's eyes gleamed wild, but in their depths flickered a spark of confusion. This man was not like the others. "Walk away, old man." Frank Dalton's voice cut sharp through the hush, his tone rich with mockery. This crowd came for blood, not a funeral. But Henry didn't answer. His gaze never left Thunder, steady as the horizon. He lifted one hand, palm open, fingers spread, not commanding, not coaxing, simply present. The gesture carried no force, only quiet resolve. The crowd gasped as Thunder lunged forward, dirt flying in a storm. The stallion charged straight at Henry, ears pinned, teeth bared. Eli's heart seized in his chest, and a woman screamed. Sure, the old man would be trampled flat. At the last moment, Thunder veered, his massive body twisting sideways, hooves striking the ground just feet away. Dust engulfed Henry, coating his shirt and hat, but he did not move. He stood rooted, hand still raised, as though he had expected the charge all along. The dust cleared slowly. Thunder tossed his head, frustrated, his tail lashing like a whip. He circled tighter, his breath a harsh rhythm in the silence. Yet every time his gaze met Henry's, he faltered for a fraction of a second. The bleachers creaked as the townspeople leaned forward, compelled by the strange scene unfolding. They had come to see a man tossed into the dirt, broken like the others. Instead, they found themselves watching a conversation too quiet for them to understand, a dialogue of eyes and breath and stillness. Henry's lips moved. Those close enough could just barely catch his words. "I won't fight you, boy. I won't give you war." Frank laughed harshly, forcing the crowd's attention back toward him. "Don't be fooled. He's just waiting to die slower than the rest." His voice cracked with the edge of frustration, though he hid it under a sneer. But the crowd wasn't laughing. Not now. They had seen Thunder's hesitation, the way the stallion pulled back instead of striking. It was enough to plant a seed of doubt in every heart, maybe. Just maybe. The old man knew something no one else did. Henry lowered his hand slowly, then took another step forward. Dust shifted under his boots, and the sound of leather creaked softly. Thunder froze, ears twitching. The air grew heavier, as though the entire arena was caught between two heartbeats. The stallion's chest heaved, muscles quivering, ready to explode again. But he didn't. He only snorted, tossing his mane, testing the air between them. Eli's mother tugged at his arm, whispering, "Don't look." But Eli couldn't tear his eyes away. He had never seen anyone stand so calmly in the face of such fury. To him, it was more than bravery, it was something sacred. Thunder poured the dirt again, carving grooves into the ground, but his charge didn't come. Henry's presence, quiet and unshaken, had created a tension no one could deny. The arena was no longer just a pen holding a beast. It had become a stage for something deeper, a battle of patience against pride, of respect against rage. And as Henry stood in the heart of the dust, thunder circling like a storm cloud tethered to earth, the crowd realized they were witnessing something entirely different from what they had come for. This was no rodeo trick, no gamble for money. It was the beginning of a story that none of them would ever forget. The arena seemed to shrink as Thunder let out a scream that rattled every nail in the corral. His muscles bunched like coiled steel, and then he launched forward, the ground trembling under his hooves. The sheer violence of his charge was enough to send the front row of the bleachers reeling back in fear. Dust boiled up in waves, blinding and choking, and through it all Henry Walker stood in the center, unmoving, waiting for the storm to reach him. Thunder closed the distance in a heartbeat. His hooves cut furrows deep into the dirt, his teeth flashing white as his head whipped side to side. The crowd erupted into shouts, warnings, curses, even prayers, but Henry didn't move. He stood as if rooted to the very earth beneath him, his eyes locked onto the stallion's burning gaze. At the final moment, Thunder reared high, forelegs pawing the air, casting a massive shadow over Henry. The stallion's scream split the sky, and the crowd thought this was the end. But Henry did something no one expected. He tilted his chin up, lifted his hand again, and breathed out slowly, like a man greeting an old friend. The stallion crashed back to earth, hooves slamming so close that dirt sprayed across Henry's boots. The shockwave rippled up his legs, but still he held steady. The old man's palm remained open, unwavering in the wall of dust. Gasps rippled through the bleachers. No rider before had lasted this long face-to-face with Thunder's fury without being tossed, trampled, or humiliated. Yet here was Henry frail, aged, and weaponless, standing calm in the eye of the storm. Thunder shook his mane violently, frustrated. He spun away, then wheeled back with a sudden burst of speed. His flank brushed so close to Henry that the air itself seemed to shove against him. Eli gripped the railing so tightly his fingers went numb. His voice caught in his throat, unable to decide between fear and awe. Henry didn't chase. He didn't flinch. He simply followed the stallion with his eyes, turning his head slowly as Thunder circled again. His words, too soft for most to hear, rode on the air like a prayer. "You're not my enemy. You're only trying to be heard." Frank Dalton laughed from his perch at the rail, though his voice carried a ragged edge. "He's just getting warmed up. That beast will tear him apart piece by piece." He slapped the wood for effect, trying to reignite the jeers, but the crowd no longer laughed. Their faces were taut with something new expectation, the kind that made their hearts race faster than their thoughts. Thunder charged again, this time angling his massive body to strike. His chest barreled forward, his eyes wild, his ears pinned flat. Dust whirled behind him in a cyclone, but Henry did the impossible. He stepped toward the beast. Just one small step, deliberate and steady, and the effect was like a stone dropped into water. The stallion's hooves dug into the ground at the last instant, throwing dirt into the air. He stopped so suddenly that the crowd screamed, sure Henry had been crushed. But when the dust cleared, the old man still stood, his hand outstretched, the distance between them barely an arm's length. Thunder's nostrils flared, his chest heaving. The whites of his eyes showed, but there was hesitation there, a crack in the mask of rage. He snorted once, a sharp burst that sent flecks of foam across the dirt, then backed away in a short, jerking stride. Henry lowered his hand, not in defeat, but as though granting space. His voice carried again, firmer this time. "I won't strike you, I won't chain you, but I will not fear you." A low murmur swelled in the stands. Some shook their heads, muttering that it was madness. Others leaned forward with wide eyes, unable to deny what they had just witnessed. For the first time all afternoon, Thunder's fury hadn't ended with a man broken in the dirt. It had ended with the horse stepping back. Eli whispered, almost to himself. "He's talking to him." The stallion spun again, restless, lashing out at the air. His power was undiminished, his fury far from spent. But the rhythm of the fight had shifted. He was no longer the sole master of the arena. Something about the old man's steadiness, his refusal to flinch or dominate, had carved out a fragile place between them. Frank shouted louder, his pride cracking beneath the silence that followed each of his jeers. "Don't be fooled. That animal's toying with him." His words fell flat, met with silence and sidelong glances. The crowd was no longer laughing with Frank. They were listening with Henry. Thunder let out another scream and stomped the dirt hard enough to rattle the boards. The sound was violent, defiant. Yet in the space that followed, in the pause where the dust hung suspended, the people of the town felt something else bleed through the stallion's fury, uncertainty. Henry squared his shoulders, his shadow long in the late Sunday. His voice when he spoke again was steady, carrying over the hush. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The words struck like a hammer, not loud, not proud, but unyielding. The crowd inhaled together, the sound sharp and collective, as though they all understood at once that this contest was no longer about strength, nor even survival. It was about patience. And for the first time that day, the storm inside the corral began to look less like chaos and more like the beginnings of surrender. The air was thick with dust and silence. Thunder's last charge still vibrated in the bones of everyone present. But what lingered heavier than the tremors was the sight of Henry still standing. The stallion had not broken him. No one could quite explain it, but the old man's calm seemed to anchor the chaos, pulling the storm into uneasy stillness. At first, the crowd struggled to process what they had seen. For hours they had cheered, jeered, and laughed as men were thrown into the dirt. It had been a game, a spectacle. Now the mood had shifted. The laughter that once filled the bleachers had withered into awkward coughs and nervous murmurs. People leaned toward one another, whispering questions they couldn't answer. "Why hasn't Thunder crushed him yet?" one man muttered. "Maybe the horse is tired," another suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," an elderly woman in the front row said softly. "It's not exhaustion, he's listening." Frank Dalton's face burned red beneath the brim of his white Stetson. The change in the crowd's tone was unbearable. Their eyes were no longer on him, no longer feeding on his showmanship. They were fixed on Henry. The old man had stolen the center of the arena, without raising his voice, without lifting a rope, without landing a blow. Frank slammed his fist against the rail, forcing out a laugh that sounded more desperate than amused. "Don't be fooled, folks. That horse is only toying with him. Just give it a minute, and we'll be picking old bones out of the dust." But no one echoed him. The words hung limp in the hot air, unanswered. The crowd had grown suspicious of the man they once admired. The louder Frank barked, the smaller he seemed. Inside the corral, Henry took another measured step forward. His boots sank deeper into the churned dirt. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, but his eyes never left Thunder. The stallion circled once more, tail lashing, ears twitching in agitation. He gave a sudden kick toward the fence, a violent display that sent splinters flying, but he did not turn that fury on the old man. Henry lifted his palm again, steady as stone. He spoke softly, though the words carried in the hush. "I'm not here to own you. I'm here to meet you." A strange shiver ran through the stands. For the first time that day, some of the youngest in the audience, children who had giggled at riders crashing into the dirt, went completely silent. Even they sensed something had changed. Eli clung to the rail, his breath quick and shallow. His eyes darted from Thunder's trembling flanks to Henry's calm stance. He whispered, almost to himself, "He's not fighting him, he's talking to him." The boy's mother pulled at his sleeve, whispering firmly, "Don't say nonsense. That horse will kill him just the same." But her voice cracked, betraying her own doubt. Thunder stomped again, tossing up another cloud of dust. He lowered his head, then raised it high, nostrils flaring. Each motion was sharp, unpredictable. Yet there was no direct attack, only restless circling as though the stallion himself was caught in indecision. Frank tried once more to ignite the crowd, shouting over the silence. "What's the matter with you all? He hasn't proven a damn thing. Respect won't keep a man in the saddle." His voice was harsh, edged with anger, but the people did not respond. They were watching something larger than the contest Frank had promised. In that moment, Henry's stillness began to spread beyond the corral. The entire rodeo ground seemed to sink into it. The fiddles had gone quiet, the vendors hushed. Even the smell of smoke from the food stalls hung stagnant in the heavy air. The laughter that had once filled the afternoon was gone, replaced by a quiet too dense to break. Thunder halted his circling. He stood facing Henry, muscles taut, eyes gleaming. The crowd leaned forward, caught between dread and awe. Henry breathed slowly, raising his hand just a little higher, not to demand but to invite. For the briefest instant, the stallion stilled. His chest rose and fell. His ears flicked, his eyes softened ever so slightly. The crowd gasped, and for a heartbeat, It seemed as though the impossible was unfolding right before them. Then Thunder shook his head violently, breaking the moment, spinning away with a furious snort. The spell shattered, but the echo of it clung to every soul present. They had seen the first crack in the wall of the Untamable. Henry lowered his hand, but his gaze stayed firm. "It's all right," he murmured, as though speaking to both horse and crowd. "We've got time." The people stared, stunned into silence. No jeers, no laughter, only the sound of a restless stallion and the steady voice of an old man who refused to yield. The sun dipped lower in the sky, stretching the shadows across the rodeo ground. Heat clung to the air, pressing down on the crowd as if the entire town had been sealed inside an oven. Dust floated like smoke between the boards of the corral, stirred by every restless flick of Thunder's tail. Henry Walker stood in the center, steady as a weathered post planted deep in the earth. His shirt was damp with sweat, his breath slow but measured. He looked worn, fragile even, but the calm in his eyes made him seem larger than life. Around him, the bleachers held an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the murmur of a child hushed quickly by a parent. Thunder circled again, his hooves beating a restless rhythm into the dirt. He tossed his head, teeth flashing, every muscle flexing with pent-up rage. His body screamed for release, for the fight he had always known. Yet each time he passed close to Henry, something invisible held him back. The crowd could see it, a rope of silence, a taut line of patience stretched between man and beast. Frank Dalton couldn't stand it. His pride was bleeding with every moment. The crowd's attention shifted away from him. He cupped his hands and shouted, "Enough of this theater, a horse like that only knows power. Quit wasting our time, Walker, ride him or get out." But Frank's words landed like stones in water sinking fast, leaving ripples that only deepened the quiet. The people no longer answered his bravado. Their eyes belonged to Henry and Thunder, waiting to see which would break first. Henry took a small step forward. Thunder froze, ears pricked, nostrils wide. Dust swirled in the space between them, carrying the smell of sweat and earth. Henry's hand lifted again, palm open. The crowd's collective breath caught. The stallion's muscles bunched as if preparing to strike, but instead he only snorted, stamping hard enough to shake the ground. He pulled his head back, swinging wide in another circle, unable to decide whether to fight or yield. Henry lowered his hand slowly, letting the tension ease. His voice, quiet but certain, drifted across the pen. "The world's been shouting at you your whole life, hasn't it? I'm not here to add to it. I'm here to wait." The crowd shivered at the words. They were not meant for them, yet they felt them all the same. Men who had spent their lives forcing stubborn cattle into line shifted uncomfortably, as though the truth in Henry's voice touched a nerve they had long ignored. Minutes stretched like hours. Thunder circled tighter, then looser, then stood still, only to explode into sudden bursts of motion. He bucked at the air, lashed out with his hind legs, struck the dirt with his forehooves until clods of earth flew. Each display drew gasps, but Henry never moved faster than a slow breath. Patience became its own weapon. The people in the stands leaned forward, no longer calling for spectacle but caught in the strange spell of the old man's endurance. Sweat dripped down faces, hands clenched into fists without knowing why. The trial was no longer just Henry's, it was theirs too, every second demanding they confront the difference between noise and silence, force and restraint. Frank barked out another laugh, but it cracked like brittle wood. "He's stalling. He'll never ride that horse." His words were met with mutters, not cheers. For the first time, some of his own ranch hands looked away, unwilling to meet his glare. Inside the corral, Thunder slowed. His sides heaved, foam flecked his mouth. He pawed the ground but didn't charge. His great black head swung low for a heartbeat before snapping back up again, defiant. The stallion was at war not with the old man, but with something inside himself. Henry spoke once more, almost in a whisper, yet the stillness carried his words. "I'll stand here as long as I need to. You decide when we move forward." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some called him foolish, others brave, but none could deny that the air itself had shifted. The rodeo no longer belonged to Frank, no longer to the crowd's laughter. It belonged to the quiet tug-of-war between patience and pride. Thunder's ears flicked forward. He gave a low, guttural snort, then backed 2 paces, his gaze still locked on Henry. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. It wasn't surrender, not yet, but it was something new. Hesitation turning into recognition. Henry didn't press the moment. He only stood, letting the silence speak for him. Dust settled around his boots. The sun burned red in the sky, and the people of the town understood they were witnessing a test unlike anything they had ever seen. The trial of patience had begun, and no one, not even Frank, could look away. The rodeo ground had fallen into a strange kind of silence, one that hummed louder than cheers ever could. Families pressed forward in their seats. Cowboys stood with their arms folded tight, and children peeked between their parents' shoulders, wide-eyed. All of them watched the standoff inside the corral, where Henry Walker stood motionless, and Thunder, the stallion who had broken every man before him, pawed at the dirt with restless fury. The heat of late afternoon wrapped around the arena, pressing down on lungs and sticking to skin. Dust clung to every boot, every face. Thunder's sides heaved with heavy breaths, sweat streaking his black coat, foam flecking his mouth. He had circled, charged, kicked, screamed, but still the old man hadn't moved. And now something was shifting, something the crowd could feel in their bones. Frank Dalton gripped the top rail, his knuckles white beneath his polished boots. He couldn't bear it. The hush of the crowd, their fixed stares, their silence, it was all being stolen by Henry. He had promised them spectacle, promised them humiliation, and instead this weathered relic was unraveling the show with nothing more than patience. Enough, Frank bellowed, his voice cracking through the tension. If you think you've proven anything, old man, prove it the way real men do. Mount him. The words hit the crowd like a whip crack. Gasps shot through the bleachers. A few people shook their heads violently, muttering that it would be suicide. Others leaned forward, the hunger for a climax rekindled in their eyes. But Henry didn't react. His gaze remained on Thunder, steady, unwavering, as if Frank's voice hadn't touched him at all. Eli, still clutching the rail, felt his heart seize. He whispered, Don't do it." The boy's mother gripped his shoulder tighter, eyes locked on the arena with the same mixture of dread and awe that gripped everyone else. Thunder snorted and stomped, his chest expanding, his muscles quivering as though he, too, had heard the challenge. He shook his mane, a dark storm cloud scattering dust into the air, and faced Henry squarely. The two figures stood across from each other, neither yielding. Henry drew a long breath. His hand, rough and scarred, rose once more, palm outward. Slowly, with the care of a man laying down his soul, he stepped toward Thunder. The stallion froze, ears twitching. The crowd leaned forward so far. The bleachers groaned under the strain. "Ride him, Walker," Frank shouted again, desperate now. "Or admit you're nothing but smoke and talk." For the first time since stepping into the pen, Henry turned his head slightly toward Frank. His voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the stands. "I won't be rushed by you, Frank. Not by you, not by anyone. But when the time comes, I'll do more than ride him. I'll earn him." The words slid through the silence like a knife, sharp and certain. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed, but more than a few nodded without meaning to, as if Henry's calm had wrapped around them too. Thunder tossed his head, circling again, testing the space. Henry stepped once more toward the center, hands still lifted. Dust whirled around them, light caught in the air, like sparks. The stallion's eyes locked onto Henry's, wild and uncertain, but no longer only filled with rage. There was something else now, confusion, maybe curiosity. The standoff stretched long, unbearable. Then, with a sudden burst, Thunder lunged forward. The crowd cried out, sure the old man would be crushed, but Henry didn't flinch. He lifted his other hand now, both palms open, standing tall in the wall of power rushing at him. And Thunder stopped, just stopped. His chest heaved inches away, his breath hot against Henry's shirt, the ground still vibrating from the force of his halt. Dust wrapped them in a cloud, blinding the stands for a moment. When it cleared, the sight made dozens of jaws drop Henry, face to face with the beast, unbroken, unafraid. The hush was absolute. Even Frank's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Henry lowered his hands slowly, his voice softer now, meant for Thunder more than anyone else. "When you're ready, boy." Not before. The stallion backed one step, then another, tossing his head in confusion. The spell wasn't complete, but it was enough to leave the crowd shaken. Frank, desperate, to shatter the moment, spat into the dust. "Talk all you want, old man. Until you climb on that back, you've proved nothing." Henry didn't look at him again. His eyes stayed fixed on Thunder, and a decision formed in the stillness. He had walked into this corral prepared to listen, to wait. But now, As the stallion stood trembling before him, the moment demanded something more. The bold decision was no longer Frank's to push or the crowd's to beg for. It belonged to Henry and to Thunder, and with the sun sinking behind the bleachers, painting the dust in blood-red light, everyone knew the story was moving toward a reckoning no one could stop. The crowd's silence pressed down like a weight, thick and suffocating. Not a single vendor shouted, not a fiddle string dared hum. The only sound was Thunder's heavy breathing and the faint rasp of Henry Walker's boots shifting in the dirt. The old man's eyes never left the stallion's, and the stallion's restless gaze flickered between fury and uncertainty. Then, without warning, Henry did what no one expected. He reached out and laid his palm against Thunder's black neck. For a breathless instant, the world seemed to stop. The crowd leaned forward, ready for an explosion. Thunder flinched violently, muscles quivering, but he didn't lash out. He only snorted, tossing his head high, stamping with enough force to shake the boards. Henry stepped back deliberately, never rushing, as if to say, "I don't own this moment, you do." The tension snapped. Thunder erupted. With a scream, he spun on his hindquarters and lunged sideways, forcing Henry to pivot just enough to keep from being bowled over. Dust shot into the air. The stallion reared high, forelegs slashing, and then dropped into a buck so violent that the earth itself seemed to shudder. Henry moved with him, not resisting, not confronting, just shifting, keeping balance, letting the storm flow past him instead of striking against it. It was less a battle than a dance, a grim, dangerous waltz where one wrong step meant death. Gasps rose from the bleachers. Eli clutched the rail with both hands, eyes wide, whispering prayers he didn't even know he remembered. His mother held him close, but her gaze was fixed on the pen, unable to look away. Frank Dalton leaned forward, his teeth clenched. "Finally," he hissed, "now the old fool will break." Yet even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. Something about the rhythm unfolding in the corral unsettled him. It wasn't the chaos of domination he craved. It was something else, something slower and deeper. Thunder charged again, swerving at the last second, his shoulder brushing past Henry so close, the old man's hat nearly flew off. The stallion wheeled around, nostrils flaring, ready to come again. Henry turned with him, boots dragging in the dust, but his eyes were calm, unyielding. He wasn't trying to outmatch the beast he was enduring him. The crowd began to realize it. Murmurs spread, hushed and awed. He's not fighting him. He's letting the horse spend himself out. No, it's more than that. He's listening. Thunder spun, lashed, bucked again, and Henry shifted, bent, breathed with him, moving just enough to avoid catastrophe. Sweat rolled down the old man's temple, dust clung to his skin, but his composure never cracked. Every movement was deliberate, small, patient. It was survival, but it was also communication. Then came the moment that nearly stopped every heart in the arena. Thunder rose on his hind legs, towering over Henry, shadow blotting out the Sunday. With a terrifying roar, the stallion came crashing down, hooves striking so close the shock rattled the stands. Henry dropped one knee into the dirt, steadying himself, but when the dust cleared, he was still there, staring straight into the stallion's eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was defiance of the impossible. Frank shouted over the hush, trying to tear the moment apart. "It's luck, nothing but luck. The next blow will finish him." But his words rang hollow. The crowd had seen too much. They were no longer hungry for Frank's bravado. They were witnesses to something raw and unexplainable. A man refusing to fight, surviving not by force but by yielding. Thunder wheeled again, but his steps slowed. His sides heaved, foam clinging to his lips, sweat streaking his coat. He pawed at the earth, restless, but his eyes no longer burned with the same blind rage. There was caution there now, wariness, even a spark of curiosity. Henry wiped the dust from his brow with the back of his hand. His knees trembled, his chest rose and fell like bellows, but his voice carried steady. "You'll run yourself empty, boy. I'll still be here." A murmur spread through the stands. Not mockery, not jeers, something closer to reverence. The dance was not finished, but the balance had shifted. What had begun as survival was becoming something else, something far more dangerous to Frank's pride: respect. Eli's voice cracked in a whisper. "He's winning, but not the way I thought." The stallion stood, head high, chest pumping, staring at the old man who refused to fall. The dust swirled like smoke around them, turning the corral into a stage where strength wasn't measured by force, but by endurance. And in that ring of dirt and silence, the crowd realized they weren't watching a fight anymore. They were watching a conversation. The dance of survival had begun to change into the first steps of understanding. The rodeo ground seemed suspended between breaths, as though the entire town held its chest tight, waiting for the next move. Dust still floated in the air, catching the dying sunlight and painting the corral in shades of gold and rust. Thunder stood with his chest heaving, nostrils wide, foam dripping from his mouth, but he did not charge. His great, black frame trembled with contained energy, yet his eyes lingered on Henry instead of blazing past him in blind rage. Henry remained in the dirt, one knee bent from his last near miss. He rose slowly, deliberately, every joint groaning but his movements steady. He brushed the dust from his hat and placed it back on his head. There was no bravado, no show, just a man carrying the weight of years, standing where no one believed he could stand. The crowd stirred. Whispers cut through the silence like dry leaves rustling. He should be dead by now. Why hasn't Thunder crushed him? It's not natural. The murmurs carried disbelief, but also awe. For the first time, people were not speaking of the stallion's fury, but of the old man's calm. Frank Dalton couldn't bear it. His voice broke through, harsh and bitter. Don't be fooled. That animal's just tired. This old fool hasn't proven a damn thing until he rides. He slammed his fist against the rail, trying to stir the crowd back into mockery. But the laughter that once came easily no longer answered him. Eli leaned forward on the rail, his small hands white-knuckled. His voice shook as he whispered to his mother. He's not fighting. He's waiting for the horse to decide. His mother hushed him, but her eyes betrayed the same realization. Thunder tossed his head, mane scattering dust like sparks. He pawed at the dirt once, twice, but he didn't lunge. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, the motion subtle but unmistakable. The crowd gasped. It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't defiance either. It was hesitation, a pause that suggested something new. Henry took a single step closer. His hand rose, palm open, steady in the fading light. His voice, low but certain, carried across the arena. I'm not here to win, Thunder. I'm here to stand with you. The stallion snorted, hot breath rolling into the air. He shifted sideways, muscles tense, but he didn't turn away. The distance between them shrank until Henry could feel the heat radiating off the animal's body. Dust clung to his sweat-soaked shirt, his chest rising and falling with effort, but his presence never wavered. The crowd was silent, every eye locked on the fragile thread stretched between man and beast. Even the children, restless minutes before, sat rigid, sensing the weight of what they were witnessing. Thunder's ears twitched, his eyes darting, but slowly, hesitantly, he leaned forward. His nose brushed the air near Henry's outstretched palm, close enough that the man could feel the warmth of his breath. Gasps broke from the stands, sharp and incredulous. Mothers clapped hands over their mouths, men muttered prayers, and Eli's eyes filled with tears he didn't understand. For a moment, time fractured. The horse that no man could tame, that had broken every challenger, had chosen not to strike. The old man who should have been trampled long ago still stood, still waiting. Frank shouted again, voice cracking with desperation. It's nothing, just a trick of the moment. That horse hasn't bowed, not to him or anyone. But his words trembled. Even he felt it, the balance shifting, the power bleeding away from him. Henry withdrew his hand, not pushing the moment, not forcing the choice. His voice dropped to a whisper, audible only because the silence was absolute. You'll tell me when you're ready. Thunder stepped back, tossing his head, but the violence had ebbed. He no longer moved like a storm seeking to destroy, but like a creature wrestling with doubt. The crowd, sensing it too, leaned forward with wide eyes. They were no longer watching a fight. They were witnessing a turning point, fragile and profound. Henry's shoulders sagged, the years of strain visible in the slump of his frame. His body bore the exhaustion of the long standoff, but his eyes carried something else, hope. The arena exhaled as one, a single breath of disbelief and awe. Something irreversible had happened. It wasn't victory, not yet, but the tide had turned. Thunder had looked into the calm of an old man and for the first time chosen not to see an enemy. The weight of silence in the rodeo ground had grown unbearable. It pressed down on every chest, sank into every heartbeat. Thunder stood motionless now, his flanks heaving with exhaustion, his eyes fixed on Henry Walker. The horse's fury hadn't vanished, but something had cracked inside it, a hesitation that no one could ignore. The crowd was spellbound. Hours earlier they had laughed, cheering when riders hit the dirt, mocking their failures. Now they were hushed, afraid to breathe too loud, as though any sound might shatter the fragile balance forming inside the corral. Parents held children close, not in fear anymore, but in reverence. A boy in the front row whispered, "It looks like they're talking," and for once, no one hushed him. On the rail, Frank Dalton's jaw tightened. His pride, the pride he had built on spectacle and domination, was slipping away. He could feel it in the way the crowd no longer looked at him, the way their eyes stayed glued to the old man and the stallion. His hand trembled against the railing. He clenched his teeth and forced out a sneer. "Don't be fooled," he barked, voice cutting through the stillness. "This horse hasn't given in, he's only catching his breath. One more charge and the old fool will crumble." But even as the words left him, they rang hollow. The crowd didn't answer. Some even frowned, muttering under their breath, tired of his bluster. Henry took another step forward, slow and measured. His boots pressed into the dirt, leaving deep prints in the churned ground. He lifted his palm again, steady and calm. Thunder's ears flicked, and the stallion shifted his weight, not toward attack but toward caution. The air trembled with possibility. The people on the bleachers leaned forward, caught in the current of something bigger than rodeo bravado. They could sense it. The horse wasn't bowing to strength, but to something entirely different. Frank's pride couldn't bear it. He slammed his fist against the wood, his voice rising, ragged and desperate. "This is nothing. Tricks and waiting games. If that horse is really his, let him ride it. Let him prove it like a man." His words cracked in the heavy air, sharp but brittle. For the first time, the crowd didn't cheer. Instead, a ripple of discontent moved through them. A woman near the front called out, her voice strong, "Maybe proving it doesn't mean breaking it." Others nodded, murmuring their agreement. The tide of the people had shifted, and Frank felt the ground slipping out from under him. Henry didn't even glance at Frank. His voice carried across the dust, soft but resonant. "It isn't victory to climb where you're not invited. Respect doesn't demand, it waits." Those words, spoken plain and steady, spread through the stands like a stone dropped into water. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier laughter. Others straightened, as though touched by a truth they had forgotten. The pride that had once belonged to Frank Dalton now belonged to the silence, Henry commanded. Thunder lowered his head for a heartbeat, not in full surrender, but in a gesture so subtle it set the crowd buzzing. The stallion's breath rolled heavy into the air, washing over Henry's outstretched hand. The old man did not reach further. He only stood, letting the horse decide what came next. Frank's face flushed red, his voice breaking with fury. "You're all blind. That horse is mine. Nothing has changed." But when he looked to the people for support, he found none. Their eyes no longer met his. They were fixed on the corral, on the connection unfolding there. The fall of pride wasn't thunderous or violent. It came quiet, creeping, carried by the collective turning of a crowd who had stopped believing in Frank's power. The man who had strutted in the sunlight that morning now looked smaller, hunched against the rail, his words ignored. Henry whispered again to Thunder, though the crowd strained to hear. "No one owns you, boy. Not me. Not him. You choose who you trust." The stallion snorted, pawed once at the ground, then stood still, his chest heaving, his massive head lowered just enough to make the air tremble with wonder. The crowd exhaled as one, a collective release of disbelief and awe. Frank Dalton remained on the rail, his pride broken in ways he could not yet admit. In that moment, the old man's calm had undone years of arrogance, and though the stallion had not yet been ridden, everyone in that arena knew something had already shifted forever. The sun was dipping lower now, bleeding orange and crimson across the Texas sky. Long shadows stretched over the rodeo grounds, and the dust inside the corral glowed like smoke lit by fire. Thunder stood near the center, his body trembling from exertion, foam streaking his chest, sweat darkening his black coat. Yet he no longer looked like a beast driven only by rage. His movements had slowed, his eyes softened just enough to spark whispers in the crowd. Henry Walker remained where he had always been, still, grounded, calm. His shirt clung to his back, his breath heavy, but he had not once wavered. He waited, patient as the earth itself, offering nothing but the open palm of his hand. The people watching felt something stir deep in their chests. They had expected a bloody contest, a man thrown and broken like all the others. Instead, they witnessed a quiet transformation. a conversation made of silence and patience. Parents glanced at their children, realizing they were witnessing more than a rodeo. They were witnessing a lesson. Eli pressed so hard against the rail his chest hurt. His voice cracked in a whisper. "He's close. I can feel it." His mother tried to pull him back, but even she couldn't tear her eyes from the pen. Thunder snorted, tossing his mane. He circled once, but it was no longer the wild, furious orbit of earlier hours. His steps were slower, uneven, almost hesitant. When he came near Henry, he paused, lowering his head for the briefest moment before jerking it back up again. Gasps rippled through the bleachers. Henry's voice rose, steady, unshaken. "That's it, boy, no rush, just you and me." He didn't push, didn't step forward. He simply remained steady, letting the stallion decide. For long, aching seconds, nothing happened. Then Thunder inched closer. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared, and finally, hesitantly, his nose brushed the space near Henry's hand. The old man's palm stayed open, not closing the gap, but waiting. Dust swirled around them, catching the red light of sunset, and the arena fell utterly silent. The contact lasted no more than a heartbeat. Thunder jerked back suddenly, stamping hard enough to rattle the boards. The spell broke, but the crowd had seen it. They had seen the impossible, the wildest stallion in Texas reaching out, even for just a second, to touch the hand of a man. Cheers didn't erupt. Instead, a wave of awe spread like a hush. People turned to one another, eyes wide, mouths open, whispering what they had just witnessed. An old rancher wiped his eyes, muttering, "Never thought I'd live to see a horse like him lower his head." Frank Dalton roared above them, desperate. "It means nothing. A trick of timing. The beast hasn't bowed, hasn't given in." His voice cracked, shrill with fear more than anger. And for the first time, the people didn't just ignore him, they glared. His words sounded hollow in the face of what they had seen with their own eyes. Henry lowered his hand, letting Thunder back away. He whispered, soft enough that only the front rows might catch it. "Trust isn't forced. It's planted, and once it's planted, it grows." The plane. Crowd stirred again, uneasy yet moved. Parents nodded slowly. A few ranch hands who had once mocked Henry now leaned on the rails with furrowed brows, humbled. Eli's eyes brimmed with tears. The boy whispered, "He's teaching him. He's teaching all of us." Thunder circled once more, slower this time, his great frame weary but no longer violent. His head dipped again as he passed Henry, not in surrender, but in consideration. And the people who had gathered for blood and spectacle understood, if only dimly, that they were witnessing not an ending but a beginning. The seed of trust had been planted, and it was enough to change everything. The horizon glowed deep red, the last of the sun slipping behind the hills, turning the corral into a stage bathed in firelight. The crowd was restless but hushed, as though they all knew the story was reaching a place no one had expected. Mothers held children close, men leaned against the rails with arms crossed tight, and even the youngest cowboys in training had gone silent. Thunder stood tall, his chest rising and falling like bellows. His flanks quivered with exhaustion, sweat dripping in rivulets down his black coat. He was no longer the same beast who had entered the arena hours before, thrashing and raging without pause. Now, he stood uncertain, his wildness still alive but tempered by something new recognition. Henry Walker's presence hadn't wavered. The old man looked like a silhouette carved out of patience itself. His back ached, his shirt clung heavy with dust and sweat, but his hand remained steady, palm open, the silent invitation he had offered since the moment he stepped into the dirt. Frank Dalton's voice shattered the quiet, bitter and raw. "Don't think this means anything. That horse is still mine. One touch doesn't change his nature." His words carried across the bleachers, but instead of stirring agreement, they landed like stones in water. People no longer looked to him for certainty. Their gazes returned to the pair inside the pen. Henry's voice rose, calm and sure, meant for thunder but carried for all to hear. "Strength isn't measured in how hard you strike, but in how long you can wait. It isn't in the rope or the spur, it's in the patience to let another soul choose to meet you." The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading. Old ranchers nodded slowly, their faces lined with the memory of battles fought with whips and force. Younger cowboys frowned, wrestling with the lesson. Children looked up at their parents, questions forming silently in their eyes. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, his mane rippling in the dying light. He circled Henry once, slower than before, his eyes searching. The old man did not follow. He simply turned with him, never breaking that steady gaze. When the stallion drew close again, Henry did something bold. He stepped forward, shortening the space between them, and placed his hand gently on Thunder's damp shoulder. Gasps rippled through the bleachers. Some cried out warnings, expecting the horse to erupt. But Thunder didn't lash out. He flinched, shifted, stamped once, and then slowly stilled. Henry's palm rested against him, not pressing, not forcing, just resting, as though acknowledging the stallion's strength. His voice dropped low, almost tender. "You're stronger than me in body, but strength isn't just muscle. Strength is choosing when not to fight." The words meant for the horse carried straight into the hearts of the people. Men who had built their lives on dominance and grit found themselves unsettled. Women who had endured hardship understood the weight of patience. Children saw a kind of power they'd never been taught to admire. Frank tried to sneer, but his voice faltered. "This is weakness dressed up as wisdom. A horse only respects power." But even his ranch hands weren't nodding anymore. Some had their hats pressed to their chests, eyes fixed on Henry. With a mixture of shame and awe, Thunder exhaled heavily, his head lowering until it hovered level with Henry's chest. The old man slid his hand up, brushing the stallion's neck, then stepped back deliberately, offering space once again. The crowd saw it for what it was. Henry was proving he did not need to hold on to win. A boy's voice rang clear in the stillness. Eli, unable to hold back, whispered loudly, "He's showing us that strength is kindness." His mother pulled him close, but her eyes shone with the same truth. The people who had come expecting dust and blood now found themselves witnesses to something deeper. They weren't watching a horse being broken, they were watching pride itself being remade. The lesson of strength had been delivered not with whips or ropes, but with an open hand and the patience of an old man who had nothing left to prove. And in that moment, the crowd knew the rodeo had become something it had never been before. A place where strength bowed not to violence, but to respect. The last of the daylight slipped behind the hills, leaving the arena bathed in twilight. Lanterns flickered to life around the rodeo grounds, their glow soft and golden against the gathering dark. The heat of the day had broken, and with it something else had cracked wide open: the pride of a man, the fear of a crowd, and the legend of a horse once called Untamable. Thunder stood still now, head low, sides trembling from exhaustion but no longer from fury. His black coat gleamed damp in the dim light, his breath a steady rhythm instead of a battle cry. The stallion's eyes no longer burned with wild fire, but glimmered with something deeper: acceptance. Henry Walker laid his hand once more on Thunder's neck. The touch was gentle, deliberate, carrying neither conquest nor demand. For a long, suspended moment, the entire town seemed to lean forward, waiting for a buck, a scream, a final explosion of rage. None came. Thunder shifted his weight, snorted softly, and pressed just slightly into the old man's hand. The crowd gasped, not with shock now, but with awe. Frank Dalton staggered against the rail, pale under his hat. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The spectacle he had promised had turned against him. The horse he had flaunted as a weapon of pride now stood calm beside the very man he had mocked. The crowd's silence was no longer for Frank. It was for Henry and Thunder, and for the lesson rising out of the dust. Henry turned toward the stands, his weathered face lined with sweat and years, his voice steady but tired. "You've all seen enough to know strength isn't in forcing another down. It's in standing long enough for them to rise beside you. This horse isn't mine, not Frank's, not anyone's. He belongs to his own will. Tonight, he chose not to fight." The words sank deep, heavier than the silence. Some in the crowd wiped their eyes. Others lowered their heads, ashamed of the laughter and jeers they had joined hours earlier. Eli slipped free from his mother's grasp and pressed against the rail, his voice breaking with emotion. "Mr. Walker, will you teach me? Teach me to listen like that?" Henry met the boy's gaze, his tired eyes softening. He nodded once, a small, quiet gesture. It was enough. The boy's face lit up with something no money could buy: hope. Thunder shifted again, stamping once, but not in defiance. He moved closer to Henry, his great head lowering until it brushed the man's shoulder. A collective gasp swept the stands. The untamable stallion, the beast of pride and fury, now stood quietly beside the old man, as if they had been walking together their whole lives. Frank finally found his voice, though it was cracked and hollow. "It's a trick. He's just worn out. Tomorrow he'll be the same beast." But the people no longer believed him. An elderly woman near the front called back, "Maybe tomorrow he'll remember what happened tonight." Maybe we all will." Her words rippled through the crowd, carried by nods and murmurs of agreement. Henry didn't look at Frank. His attention stayed on the stallion, his voice a whisper meant only for the horse but somehow heard by all. "You've carried your fury long enough. Rest now. You're not alone anymore." Thunder let out a low breath, almost a sigh, and stood still. The crowd broke at last, not with wild cheers but with a soft swell of applause, quiet and reverent, like a congregation honoring something sacred. Henry slid his hand from Thunder's neck, stepping back with dignity. He didn't raise his arms in triumph, didn't seek the adoration of the crowd. He simply walked toward the gate, the stallion following one step behind. The sight struck deeper than any victory, the horse choosing to walk beside the man. As the gate opened, the townsfolk stepped aside instinctively, leaving a clear path. No one shouted, no one demanded more. They only watched in silence as Henry and Thunder passed, a boy trailing behind with eyes wide in wonder. The rodeo was over, but something greater had been written into the dust. The memory of the day when patience outlasted fury, when dignity outshone pride, when respect proved stronger than domination. The legacy of dignity would not fade. It would live in the hearts of every witness, told and retold long after lanterns burned out and the dust settled back into the earth. And as Henry disappeared into the twilight with Thunder at his side, the town knew they had not just seen a man tame a horse. They had seen a man teach them how to be human. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe true strength comes from force or from patience and respect? Drop a simple 0 if you think it's force, or a 1 if you think it's patience. Your comment means a lot. Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell, because more stories like this where pride falls and wisdom rises are waiting for you in the next videos.